Nice. Well, I obviously read a lot of books for the podcast and just for myself, and I have to say this book is really beautifully written. I was really impressed with the writing of the book and kind of
Thank you.
melding these six lives together. Could you talk a little bit about these six maybe profiles or stories, however you would say it, and kind of some of the circumstances that they, dealt with?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, there's six subjects in the book. Valerie Pirro, Sophie Papp, Gina Appleby, Jason Dixon, Sean Taylor, and J.R. Vigil. Just to kind of do a brief sort of capsule summary of each of them. So Valerie, uh, and also, perhaps it goes without saying that these are all people that experience these sort of catastrophic, life-altering events. And the book obviously kind of investigates and examines how their lives and identities were changed in the wake of these before and after events. And so for Valerie, um, she was a high school student in New York City, and she was a passenger um, in a van that had a major accident, which left her paralyzed. Um, and Sophie Papp uh, was somewhat of a comparable age. I think maybe a couple years older, maybe 3 years older. She was also in a car accident, but the consequences were substantially different. So she suffered a traumatic brain injury, and as I outlined in the book, the kind of the consequences and ramifications of that were really quite myriad, including significant changes and just a dramatic influence on her personality and the way that she interacted with individuals, with family members, and on top of all the kind of more physiological consequences of her accident. And then there's Gina Appleby. Um, she was somebody who had visual impairment for most of her life. And so, she already really was frankly dealt a really difficult hand and was kind of grappling with that for her entire adolescence and early adulthood. And soon after she graduated from college, she, basically she experienced, a pretty serious sexual assault and had to navigate the aftermath of that and how that kind of had this huge impact on her psyche, and the PTSD symptoms she experienced, and the way that she kind of um, grappled with that additional layer being put on her identity. And that's kind of something that's discussed in one of the chapters. Um, in terms of on the male side, there's Jason Dixon, who was a little bit older when we meet him in the book. He basically suffered from an opioid addiction, which I think was a useful opportunity to spend a little bit of time at least incorporating the opioid epidemic into the book, because that actually has been something that's fascinated me for a long time. I have written about it for various publications, so I found it really worthwhile to look into his story. And he ended up basically committing armed robbery to support this vicious, implacable opioid addiction, which resulted in him going to prison for a number of years. And then you have Sean Taylor, who was involved in what turned out to be a fatal shooting, also in his late adolescence. He ended up spending about 20 years, about 2 decades in prison. Um, and the final subject is J.R. Vigil, who was in a very severe car accident on Guam, that basically, his body was so badly damaged and his legs were so badly injured that surgeons had to amputate both of his legs.
Mm,
And so, there one thing that does sometimes jump out about these six subjects is that there is a little bit of overlap. But in terms of the actual consequences of each of these catastrophic life events, I think they are very different in terms of the injuries, the disabilities, the psychological impacts. Their stories really, diverge and are, extremely unique in a number of ways.
mm. I appreciate that. Um, Such a fascinating project and book exploring so many different um, lives and situations. And maybe it's worth talking about this Nietzsche quote that you write about in the beginning of the book. Listeners may be familiar with it, but this, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, yeah. I mean, as I mentioned sort of at the beginning, this was kind of one of the galvanizing ideas behind the book. Um, Nietzsche's line, "What doesn't kill us," or what I mean, technically, what he wrote was, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And I kind of uh, outlined how that line sort of became this really powerful maxim in America and the American kind of cultural zeitgeist and online and people have tattoos. It's just something that like almost everybody has heard, and it seems reasonably apparent that a lot of people are to some degree emotionally invested in it. And I certainly was invested in it for a long time, having kind of experienced a number of serious adversities in my own life. I really somewhat passionately subscribed to that idea, the idea that our adversities, our hardships, our obstacles over time, can make us into stronger people. Um, but as I discussed in the introduction to the book, um, there were certain periods in my late, basically as I got closer to starting the book, that really made me kind of take a more skeptical approach to that aphorism, and begin to kind of become interested in examining it and interrogating it. And to some extent, the jumping off point for the book is understanding that, well, if that's not true, then how can we add more nuance to it? How can we complicate this idea? Or how can we refute it altogether? And what's going to replace it? If we're not kind of one dimensionally, simplistically stronger after these sort of catastrophic adversities, then how else do we change? What are kind of the patterns and the overarching truths about how people change after these major negative life events?
Mm. I love that. How can we, excuse me, how can we add more nuance? How can we complicate it? Um, I love that. So often we're trying to do the opposite with things and try to simplify things. I made
Right.
a note of something you write in the book. Those leading afterlives must accept the inherent tensions and contradictions of their fates and internal lives that cannot be neatly categorized. Could you talk a little bit about, this term afterlives that you use?
Yeah, of course. So the idea of afterlives is it's kind of a category that I created for this book. Um, it basically it speaks to people who have had these catastrophic or major dramatic life altering experiences that could be a serious car accident, a serious period of incarceration, acquired disability, whether that's paralysis, amputation, acquired blindness, things like that. Um, Certainly, different types of mental illness and psychological challenges. I definitely interviewed people, with PTSD. Basically anything that is creating this chasm or this gap from everything up until the experience and then everything after. And so I think that, a lot of people, especially over the course of the reporting process, it's kind of like, it if you've experienced it. If you've had one of these kind of just substantial, significant, life altering events, you know what it feels like on a pretty deep level to look at your life in this bifurcated way in terms of a before and an after. And so, people who have had those experiences where they really can't return to the before part of their lives, they can't return to the status quo that we all frankly cling to. They're the ones that exist in these afterlives, and they're the ones that have to, yeah, kind of make sense of their identities in a kind of a new territory and in a place where they really can't go back to the way things were, because that's what most of us want, I think, especially after serious adversity and tragedy. We just want to go back to the way things were. And in some cases, I think that's possible, um, but certainly not in all cases. And to me, what I was really drawn to with the book and with kind of creating this category that I termed afterlives is, again, just focusing on these people who really couldn't go back.
Mm. Yeah, you write in the book that we can't get back on the horse that we rode in on, and obviously say, not in all cases. I was thinking a little bit about a quote from Nietzsche as I was reading through the book. Another quote which I don't remember it exactly, but to paraphrase it, it's something about knowing ourselves. We have so many skins. How can we ever, be for sure that this is the real me? And I don't know, it made me curious about this fact of what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Yeah, we can't really say that. And obviously something we talk about quite a bit on the podcast, that it's subjective in any way as we think about this idea of stronger, and it's more nuanced and complicated. But what about this idea of knowing ourselves? You think of the Delphic maxim, know thyself. In your experience of talking to so many different people that have, dealt with some of these traumatic events in life, can we say that it's a path to greater self-awareness, or a greater understanding of who we are?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. There's definitely a lot of layers there. Um, I think that I would probably answer it in a couple of ways. The first is, that there's no question that these experiences, they do create or uncover different skins, so to speak. So, they're changing these people's identities on a really deep level. Um, so, maybe you're kind of a more carefree teenager or 20 something, and suddenly you have this serious catastrophe or tragedy that is changing your outlook forever, and is kind of imposing on you certain obligations and responsibilities and burdens that you would have never imagined were going to be such defining elements of your life. um, with the case of someone like Sean, or Valerie, or Sophie for that matter. So I do think that it's changing people's identities in a really fundamental way. Um, but with that said, there is some truth to what you're saying in terms of, is it forcing us to understand ourselves in a different way or on a deeper level? Um, so I think that one thing that I can certainly personally speak to, and that I do discuss in the book, and that I kind of was able to to see or discern from these subjects is when you go through these experiences, it's kind of limiting your freedom, and it's inhibiting certain aspects of your character or the aspects of your identity that you lean the most on leading up to these catastrophic life events. You may not be able to lean on them anymore. Um, and so what these experiences have in common, in my opinion, and in my reporting, is that they force you to look into other parts of your identity, um, for things to cultivate, to work on, to develop, to strengthen, so that they can become kind of the pillars of the person that you will, ideally, ultimately transform into. And so, in a lot of cases, these experiences, because they're inhibiting the parts of ourselves that were the most dominant or that we allowed to thrive to the greatest degree, um, we're forced to search elsewhere. We're forced to kind of branch out in terms of our identity, to find the parts of ourselves that we still have kind of unfettered access to, and that we can, use and kind of ride and develop to the point where we have more meaning, we have more purpose, we've regained some semblance of a solid sense of self.